Yesterday I had a book review published in the Wall Street Journal on the great Walter Mischel's book called The Marshmallow Test. And the marshmallow test is, you've seen this, where you give a little kid a single marshmallow and you say, if you wait 15 minutes, you can have 2 marshmallows. Anyway, it's a study of delay of gratification, which back in the 70s was just sort of another interesting area of study. But Mischel followed up 40 years later and found out that the kids that were able to delay gratification, employ self-control, and have willpower to wait for the second marshmallow had higher SAT scores, higher GPAs, higher incomes later in life, lower body mass index things. This thing leapt out of the lab and suddenly became, like the thing that all Wall Street traders were, I'm going to wait for the second marshmallow, or investment companies encouraged you to, save for that second marshmallow, and parents had kids wear these t-shirts that said, I waited for the second marshmallow. Anyway, it's just all too much when these things get too popular like that. People pointed out that the original kids were the children of Stanford University college professors, not exactly your typical random sample. And other people pointed out that, in fact, if you live in an unstable home or you have lots of siblings, you're an idiot to wait 15 minutes for the second marshmallow. And to the investment companies, waiting and saving up to have the greatest 90th birthday ever is probably not also the wisest thing. So there's some balance. This is all a way of saying that once in a while some scientific ideas leap out of the lab and the media and popular culture goes crazy. This explains everything. And The Myth of Mirror Neurons is the most important book we have on this myth-busting subject, because mirror neurons is the new version of that. You see it everywhere. It explains everything. And, well, maybe it doesn't. So Dr. Gregory Hickok is a professor of neuroscience at UC Irvine, and his book just came out. It's a great read. It's beautifully done. He's got all the research starting from the very beginning when this first leapt out of the lab, and then what we really know about mirror neurons. So with that, please help me welcome Dr. Gregory Hickok.
Well, I think that's the most unique introduction I've had. Thank you for that. Thanks for inviting me out, and thanks for coming out on a Sunday. I'm very happy to be here. I'm just curious, how many of you have heard of mirror neurons before you heard about this talk? Okay, so maybe half of you. Part of what I want to do is explain to you why the scientific community got so excited about mirror neurons, particularly in psychology and neuroscience. It's gone beyond that. It's gone into economics, it's gone into child rearing, it's gone all over the place. And eventually you would have heard of them if you hadn't before this talk, and if no one did anything to try to slow the excitement. And I'll kind of show you why. People are already using it in psychotherapy and all sorts of things. These, in case you haven't heard, these are cells that have been claimed to have shaped civilization. Their discovery was equivalent to that in terms of doing for psychology what DNA did for biology. Some people call them the tiny miracles that get us through the day. I always thought that was caffeine. It bind us with each other mentally and emotionally. So it's substantial. I want to back up a bit and give you the context for in terms of what mirror neurons are claimed to be doing. Claim to be explaining. So what's at stake? Why should you care? Why do people care so much? So, and this is backing way up, the broadest context. So we like to say that we live in the information age, and it's absolutely true that digital technology of our age allows us to communicate instantaneously or virtually instantaneously anywhere. You can get information in your hand right now. And that's pretty amazing. This is an image of an internet map generated by looking at connections between IP addresses. Looks kind of cool. Nothing to do with the talk today. But we live, in fact, we've always lived in a world of information, whether it is in terms of gathering the right information, in terms of choosing the right mate, in terms of figuring out where to find food, or what kinds of things you need to be avoiding. This is information, and we need to survive, we need to capitalize on this information. So one road to evolutionary success or one route is to select for mental capacities that improve the collection, use, and communication of information. And we are masters of doing that. We've developed quite a brain structure for collecting, manipulating, and communicating information. This is a map of a recent map of the so-called human connectome. It's another thing that people are saying is going to explain the mind. I don't think it's going to any more than diagramming, generating a circuit diagram of my laptop here will explain how it works. I want to talk about what we've developed in terms of technologies or mental capacities for communication, information processing. In terms of what I'm calling the big three, and this isn't the only three, but there are three aspects of our mind's ability that people have singled out and suggested that they set us apart from other animals in terms of our ability to process and manipulate information. One of them, of course, is language, which you can think of as the power to transplant complex information from one mind to another, like I'm doing right now. I'm taking ideas in my mind and somehow transplanting them in yours. And that's, if you think about it for a second, is a pretty remarkable thing. Scientists who study language don't think of language the way most people do, and you can talk to Steve Pinker about this quite a bit. While he's here, it'll get him off track, but that's okay. Steve was my postdoc advisor at MIT. We think of it instead of a collection of words with meanings that you can pull out of a dictionary and a set of rules for, that you have to learn from the environment, that is, the language is out there. We think of it instead as a biological system. It is the mechanism by which our brains are able to take thoughts, which are in their own format, and transform them into wiggles in your mouth that generate variations in air pressure. And that's all that's coming out of my mouth and hitting your ears, of course. And then you have to do the reverse transform to get those air pressure waves back into something meaningful. That requires a fair amount of engineering, and that is specialized. Our brains developed to do this. But we think of it as a biological system, not so much a cultural thing. But that's another lecture. Mind reading is not what you think. Mind reading in the scientific world, in the cognitive world, it basically refers to the ability to recognize that behavior is caused by mental states. So you decided to come here, you presumably believe that your decision to come here was willful, that you wanted to hear about this and you figured out how to get here. And your beliefs, wants, and desires basically determined your behavior. You also believe that I have my own beliefs, wants, and desires in my own mind that generate my own behavior. This is called theory of mind, and it's much studied in cognitive psychology. It is essential in terms of what humans are able to do. That is, it allows us to make inferences about the actions of others. So if I do something right now, you can look at my actions and make inferences about what I'm thinking that would drive that behavior. And that's basically what is meant by mind reading. So if you see someone struggling, digging through their pockets, standing next to a car with a bag of groceries, you can figure basically what's going on. They've lost their keys, they're trying to get in the car, you can figure that they might be upset. That's the kind of mind reading we're talking about. And although I don't have much time to go into it, this is a critical ability in kids learning to develop this. It seems to go wrong in certain disorders like autism, although that's also another myth that we'll touch on briefly. Imitation is thought to be the foundation, by some anyway, is thought to be the foundation for things like language and mind reading, and I'll talk about that. In fact, some people have suggested that that the recipe for sapience is essentially our ability to imitate, humans' unique ability to imitate. Some people will call us homo imitans instead. So these are the foundations. Each of these areas is a scientific industry in its own right. People working in these fields have their own complex cognitive theories. Like any scientific domain, it's rich, it's complex, there's lots of theory, lots of data. People working in between these areas often work within those areas and don't talk across those domains. They're their own sciences. And they're not very well understood in terms of their neuroscience, their neural basis, or evolution. So that's always been kind of a struggle. Where do these abilities come from if they're so unique in humans? This is where the story comes back to mirror neurons, or where the mirror neuron story starts. So that's the context I want you to see in terms of issues that cognitive scientists and neuroscientists are dealing with. Giacomo Rizzolatti is an Italian neuroscientist, very well known for studying motor control, mostly using southern pigtail macaque monkeys. That's one here. And his interest is in how these animals reach for things. He was studying it intensely in the late 80s and doing some beautiful work, essentially trying to figure out how you can take information, visual information about where an object you're interested in grasping is, and use that to guide movements. It's actually a complicated task. I won't have time to give you details about how complicated that is, but that all on its own, looking at how we control movements is a fascinating topic. Richard Anderson here at Caltech is one of the major players in that area as well. So they were interested in studying how animals grasp objects, and they were looking in a macaque region known as F5, that's frontal area 5. They were using the single unit method, as it's called. And this is basically involves inserting a very tiny electrode into the monkey's brain, situating it next to a neuron that they're interested in studying, a brain cell, and basically recording its electrical impulses or action potentials. And what they noticed while they were asking monkeys to reach for various objects is that they found cells in F5, which is a motor area, that responded or fired vigorously during the monkey's reaching. And this is an example of that. So these different boxes here correspond to different objects that is presented to the monkey, so a plate, a cube, a cone, sphere, a cylinder, a ring. And they found that there was a fair amount of specificity in what a particular cell responded to. So this particular cell responds to reaching towards rings and not so much to cubes. So there was a specificity for the cell's preference in terms of which grasp drove the neuron. Just to tell you what these things show, each one of these lines here is a trial. Each one of these dark marks is an action potential or the neuron firing. And down below is just a histogram over trials, how much it fires. And you can see that the preferred cell for this, preferred object for this neuron is a ring. They also just looked at what happened in these same cells when you simply presented an object and the monkey just sat there and looked at it. So no motor behavior at all, just watching. And what they found was that these cells in F5 also responded during object viewing, just simple object viewing. So they have sensory and motor response properties. And in a lot of cases, the preferred grip and the preferred object type lined up. So if you had a cell that liked to reach for rings, it also fired during the observation of a ring. Now, keep in mind that when you reach for things, you don't just reach out blindly and then grope around for it. Your hand is pre-shaped to grasp the objects that you're reaching for. So if I'd like to reach for this, I don't reach this way or just blindly do it. I'll just reach out and pre-shape my hand. And presumably, that pre-shaping is driven by the object shape and location. That was a useful example. So basically, the idea was that you could take object shape information and use that to access a kind of inventory or vocabulary of grip types. So you can see different object shapes will require different grip types. And object shape was, because this cell has sensory motor response properties, it was providing a mechanism for using object shape to select actions. That was the theory. So this is what this group was studying when mirror neurons were discovered. It was actually a bit of a serendipitous discovery. They were, again, working on this object grasping paradigm, trying to really figure out what was going on. And they were doing it, the way they were doing it is they would have a little display case, and they would swap objects in and out to go from one trial to the next. The electrophysiological recording device was still recording during these in-between trials. And it's actually played in the lab, so you typically wire these things up to a speaker in the lab so you can hear the cell firing. And what they noticed while they were swapping objects in and out was that the monkeys, some of the monkeys' brain cells was responding just when the experimenter was grasping for an object to swap it out. And that hadn't been seen before in the motor area. It was responding to movements. It was responding to actual actions. So this team quickly set up a study, a more formal study, using one monkey. They recorded from 184 motor neurons. They wanted to know, in F5, they wanted to know whether it was really selected for actions. So they did all sorts of things, like dancing around in front of the monkey, just to see if it really was the actual gesture of reaching and grasping something that the cell was responding to, and it was. It didn't respond to general movements. It didn't respond to threatening stances or anything like that. It responded while the experimenter was actually grasping. So just to give you some numbers, they found 48 that responded to viewing objects. That's the typical now called canonical cells that I talked about, that they were initially investigating. They found 39 cells that responded to viewing actions. That's this new type of cell. 12 of them, of the 39, showed a correspondence between preferred execution and observation. That is, that when the monkey generated a grasp of a particular type, remember they're tuned to particular types of grasps, and the experimenter generated the same type of grasp the cell fired in both those cases. So there was specificity. It responded less vigorously during other types of grasps. So this is mirroring. It was published in 1992. The first example, 12 cells, and that is basically, that result is the fundamental foundation of mirror neurons, this whole enterprise. It was replicated in 1996 involving 2 monkeys. They sampled 532 neurons. I don't need to give you the numbers. It basically replicated. The same result obtained. It's a real effect. Monkeys do have these cells. There's no question about that. That's not what the myth is. So basically, this is the foundation. People got really excited about this eventually. It took about a decade, but people got really excited about this. And this is the foundation here for all this stuff. So this is just stuff that I pulled off and quoted from various places. The mirror neuron revolution. There was a show on Nova. The #1 scientific breakthrough would no doubt be the discovery of mirror neurons. We already know they shaped civilization. New York Times published a story called Cells That Read Minds. The Dalai Lama got roped into it. The roots of sports fandom and humanity are supposedly have something to do with mirror neurons. It's not the empirical observation. So I told you what the observation was, and you didn't go jumping around excitedly. This observation is really not the exciting part. It's the interpretation, of course, as it always is with scientific results. And this is the interpretation. So the second major paper was titled Action Recognition in Premotor Cortex, which tells you what their interpretation of this response was. And to cite a later paper applying to humans and monkeys, we understand action because the motor representation of that action is activated in our brain. So let me just give you an intuitive sense of what's actually happening. I like to walk around when I talk. Can you guys hear me? You hear me okay? All right, I'll wander back now and then. So the basic idea then is that when I generate an action, what you're doing in your brain is, so when I generate an action, I know what I'm doing. I know what my goal is. I know why I'm doing it. So I understand my own actions. The way you can understand my actions is by simulating my actions in your brain. So you see this movement, you simulate that movement in your brain. And because you know what you do, what you're doing when you generate actions, you understand your own actions, you can kind of read off your simulation to figure out what I'm doing. That's the basic idea. So you're just simulating what these cells are doing. And that's how you understand. This was extrapolated early on, in the first 2 papers, in fact, to humans. And this is a map. This is a human brain, the front, the back, the bottom, the top. It's a 3D reconstruction. This is called Broca's area. 44 is one section of it that's thought to be the homologue of a monkey area F5. And these colored areas are basically what people think of as the human mirror system. Very briefly, I want to say that mirror neurons do exist in humans. There have been doubters. Alison Gopnik said, despite all the enthusiastic press coverage, no one knows for sure if humans even have mirror neurons. I'm not one of the skeptics. To my mind, it is virtually a given that humans have mirror neurons. Quoted by me right now. But also, it's in here if you want to see more. They do. The reason I can be so confident that they exist is because if you generate an action, I can copy it. The only way to do that, if it's a nonsense movement, is for me to figure out, to see what you did and then reproduce it in my motor system. There's got to be a way to connect with the actions that you're seeing with the actions that you're reproducing. They have to exist. But there is evidence. It's actually very scant evidence, it turns out, direct evidence, besides the conceptual argument that I just made. There was a study in 2009 that used functional MRI, that is a way of imaging brain activity, that suggested in about 10 people that there are mirror neurons. There are ways of doing fMRI that allow us to make inferences about what individual cells are doing, which is quite interesting. And then there was a direct observation in single neuron recordings in humans. These are people undergoing brain surgery, don't do this for fun, that showed evidence in some motor areas. None of these, unfortunately, weren't able to record from there, but other areas, there were individual human cells that responded both during the execution of actions and the observation of actions. So this is the idea. We understand actions by simulation. That's the foundational idea based on that response property. Once you get this idea, you can build a pretty impressive theory, it turns out. So let me show you how. So if you understand my actions by simulating them as I grasp for things, by simulating my actions in your brain and then reading off the intentions in your own simulation of that, we can then think of language as a kind of action, which it is. I'm definitely generating movements to produce speech. You can then simulate my production of language in your brain and therefore understand language that way. Mind reading, same idea. So basically, when you read minds, as you're trying to figure out what I'm doing, what are my motivations for doing what I'm doing, you can simulate my state. So if I went over here and grabbed some more water, another convenient example, you can say, well, his mouth may be a little dry, whatever, he wants to have a drink. You can simulate what I might be feeling in my brain, simulate that in your brain and actually read my mind, understand what my intentions are. Quick question?
Wouldn't that be like empathy?
Yeah, actually. Empathy. Imitation, same thing. Imitation, again, a foundation for all of this stuff, being human. Imitation is very obviously connected to what mirror neurons might be doing. I generate a movement, you can simulate that. If you're simulating it, you could certainly execute it. So mirror neurons could be the basis of imitation. And not long after the second foundational report came out, there were claims that language is within our grasp, a nice title, that mirror neurons could explain how we process language and, in fact, how it evolved. That's one of the critical points. Here's and these are by some of this is one of the discoverers. This is a guy a computational neuroscientist at USC. Gallese, who's another mirror neuron discoverer, went in the mind reading direction to make the kind of argument that I just made. And a cortical mechanism for human imitation was discovered in 1999 that corresponded nicely to the human mirror system. It activated this Broca's area, region that is thought to be where human mirror neurons live. Empathy isn't far behind. It's very easy to see how you can feel what I'm feeling literally by simulating my condition and therefore empathize. Here it is, the shared manifold hypothesis from mirror neurons to empathy. That was a paper that came out in 2001. Notice here, too, that you have the roots of what's been called the broken mirror hypothesis of autism. Here are 4 things that mirror neurons are supposed to support, which are also supposed to be disrupted in autism. So the idea was that autism is caused by broken mirrors, and this has been a very popular idea. It is absolutely wrong. I will not talk about that. There's a whole chapter on it in the book. If you don't want to buy the book, that's okay. You can also find it at salon.com. The whole chapter is reproduced in there if you want to get the story on autism. Basically, the short version is autism is not a hyposensitivity to social interactions, the story I'm telling. It's a hypersensitivity. They're not hypo-empathic, they're hyper-empathic. When you're hyper-empathic, you don't want to engage. It's too painful. That's the basic idea. You can get the whole story in the book. 2001, the idea that mirror neurons might be connected to imitation and autism was put forward. From there, you can explain lots more. Love, if I can, love someone else like I love myself, that you get an explanation for love. Sports, that's easy to explain now because we love sports so much because we can now put ourselves through mirror neurons on the field with the players. And we're experiencing that with them, and that's why we get so enthralled with watching sports. Art appreciation, same kind of idea. From here, we've got culture, we've got art and sports, we've got language, we've got civilization, in fact, humanity. In fact, the human mind is basically explained by mirror neurons. And notice what's happened is that these areas that previously were studied separately in psychology and neuroscience are now being studied under one umbrella. A simple explanation has been provided. That's great science, is when you can reduce complicated ideas to a simple explanation. That's exactly what we should be striving for, if it's right. If it's wrong, it's not helpful. So this is why this very modest piece of data has generated claims by, for example, Ramachandran, who was the equivalent of DNA for psychology, author of that quote, and thinks that this is basically the foundation for the Big Bang of human evolution. So it took a while. So this is basically the number of scientific publications containing the term mirror neurons in the PubMed database. You can see that no one cared for the first almost 5, 6, 7, 8 years. After the theoretical papers came out connecting it to everything, then things started going crazy. And they're still going crazy. There's still lots and lots of papers coming out. These are just a list of some of the scientific papers I looked up in. These are scientific papers. Okay? These are in PubMed, in refereed journals, using mirror neurons to explain lip reading, stuttering, schizophrenia, comprehension of action words, phantom limbs, neurorehabilitation, hypnosis, misattribution of anger, and the music of avant-garde jazz saxophonists. Sexual orientation, cigarette smoking, music appreciation, political attitudes, felt presence, facial emotional recognition, obesity, the degree of male erection, psychopathic personality disorder. I wouldn't have wanted to do that experiment, honestly. It was a functional imaging experiment. Contagious yawning, business leadership, and I quote, our aesthetic response to art, music, and literature, the dynamics of spectatorship and resistance to totalitarian mass movements. Mother-infant communication and emotion processing, development of Jungian collective unconscious archetypes and self-agency, mass hysteria, drug abuse, favoritism, efficacy of group psychotherapy, risk assessment, walking dreams in congenitally paraplegic individuals, pain synthesis, self-awareness in dolphins. So you can see why I said that if you had heard about mirror neurons before this lecture, eventually you were going to hear about them. They are pervading psychology, economics, politics, all sorts of things. If you just go on the web, just Google mirror neurons, you'll turn up stuff like this. Learn how to use mirror neurons to influence people. Barack Obama is tapping into your brain via mirror neurons. I better get in front of the mic for this. Sex and mirror neurons, prayer and mirror neurons, gay mirror neurons come out. God created human beings with these mirror neurons so that do unto others would make sense to us all. How Pinterest profits from neural mirroring. I think people can make it do whatever it wants, essentially. So again, why the popularity? The popularity came from complex mental functions. These things, which are really hard to explain, it's hard to figure out how these things evolved in humans, was simply explained with a tangible neuromechanism. You can see that cell firing. So psychologists who mostly deal with abstract theories can now see a cell firing, and that's the explanation. It feels sciencey, feels real. And it had an evolutionary kicker. Now we know that we have a precursor in macaques that do this, and that was very exciting. So here's my timeline of interest in mirror neurons. I first heard of them in 1999 at a lecture that Giacomo Rizzolatti gave at a conference I attended. For about this long, I didn't care about mirror neurons. I taught a course on mirror neurons in 2007 or so, which is what us academics do when we want to learn about a topic. We teach a course on it, have our graduate students read it, and then present in class. And so I did more work than that. But looked over, basically the goal of that course was to see what was really going on with mirror neurons. So we went back and read all the foundational papers. Any students in here, read the foundational papers, read the originals. They get changed, even one generation after. And then in 2009, at the invitation of an editor of Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience, I published a critical review of mirror neuron theory. I've been the crankiest person in terms of criticizing mirror neurons. They say that any jackass can kick down a barn, but it takes a carpenter to build them. A lot of what I've been doing is kicking, which is really self-defense, and I'll explain why. But I also, as you'll see, I'll hint at it. I talk more about it in the book, but there is a constructive side to what I'm doing. Not just trying to bust the myth. There's more interesting stuff going on. So this is why I didn't care about mirror neurons. So the claim was that mirror neurons explained language. Language is my area of research. I study speech perception. I study motor control of speech production. So that's my bread and butter. I knew, so they were saying that mirror neurons, in particular this area, Broca's area, named after Pierre-Paul Broca, one of the fathers of modern neurology. The claim was that this Broca's area region was critical for understanding language, for perceiving speech sounds and doing all this because of mirror neurons. That's where the simulation happened. I knew that that couldn't be the case. There's a syndrome named after Broca called Broca's aphasia, in which there is an impairment in speech production. That is, you get the motor problem, you've damaged the motor speech control system, but you don't have a deficit in comprehension. They can perceive speech just fine. And let me show you an example of the struggles that some of these patients can have. He's going to be trying to say words like boy and girl and stool. So he's describing what's happening in the picture. A kid's on a stool trying to reach for a jar of cookies. It's a famous diagnostic test in aphasia. If you said, point to the stool, he would point to it. Point to the boy, he would point to it. No problem understanding speech, but obviously his speech production system is damaged. The mirror neuron theory predicts straightforwardly that if you disrupt the motor speech part, you should have a concomitant perceptual problem. You don't see that in these cases. So I basically said to myself, this is wrong, at least for language. Maybe it works with monkeys and action understanding. It doesn't apply to me, which is why I didn't care for a long time. This is why I did care, because part of my own research involves sensory motor integrations in speech. So it turns out that your ability to talk is crucially dependent on your ability to hear. Obviously for learning speech, but even now, when you talk, you're constantly monitoring your own speech and detecting small errors in those motor programs that you can then correct because you're detecting those errors. If you went deaf now, your speech articulation ability would start declining because you're not constantly tuning it. So this is the sort of thing that I was studying. So we would do tasks where we'd have people generate speech and listen to speech and look for overlap, sensory motor responses, so we could identify the circuit, which we did. Here's an example of one of the studies we did. The yellow part, this happened to be, I do a little bit of sign language research as well. This happened to be a study in people who were bilingual in English and American Sign Language, and so we had them listening to speech and then reproducing it. We wanted to know what areas respond to both listening and generating. And we did the same thing in sign language in the same people. The critical thing here is that this area responded both during observing and listening, as well as during the generation of language, of speech or signs. It's right in Broca's area. That's where mirror neurons are supposed to live. I thought of it from a motor control standpoint. That was my interest. But when I would go give talks on it, people would say, oh, that's mirror neurons. And I said, no, it's not. Mirror neurons are not explaining everything. This is a motor production thing. You have Broca. Remember, it's not explaining everything in mirror neurons, but it became an issue for me giving talks. And so I started having to look into it, basically. So basically, when I started to look into it, I went back and read all the foundational papers. I wasn't so much interested in explaining all of this stuff, although I did look at this. I wanted to know initially whether this assumption, going from data, the original data, to the idea that action understanding is achieved by simulation. I wanted to get at the foundation. If this is false, then all of this collapses. And so that's why I targeted this initial assumption. So how solid is this foundation? And that's what I want to talk about for the next 15 minutes or so. The monkey data doesn't tell us. The monkey data is purely correlational. You know that correlation is not causation. It's just a result. It could be coming from almost anything. So is the brain imaging data. Even though Broca's area activates during listening and generating speech, or during watching movements and generating movements, that doesn't tell us what it's doing. It's just colors on a brain. That area is active, but we don't know what it's doing. This is, the closer I looked, the more I kind of felt like the mirror neuron enterprise was something like these impossible figures. In fact, I wanted them to put something like this on the cover of the book because it perfectly captures my experience. So like if you follow an idea or a column through, it just ends up in the wrong place and things are not quite lining up. It looks good as a whole if you don't look too close. But that's basically what I started coming over. So I want to give you a list of some of these anomalies that I came across as I started to do my work. You know this one. I already talked about that. There's lots of other examples in the language domain where people don't have the ability to control speech on the motor side and yet can perceive speech just fine. You can think of Stephen Hawking, for example. I'm pretty sure he understands speech okay. There have been empirical studies of people with cerebral palsy and ALS, and the ability to process speech on the receptive side is fine. Anomaly number 2, you can understand actions that you can't execute. Okay, so you can't fly, but you know what's going on. This is a squid that squirts water out of its back end and then can fly through the air. You can't do that. But you can kind of understand that that's a form of locomotion. You can't slither or coil, and you can't grab grasshoppers with your tongue. Even things that some humans can do and you probably can't do are understandable. This is something that you can't simulate in order to understand them. There's got to be another mechanism. So that's a problem. There's a syndrome known as Mobius syndrome. This is congenital facial paralysis. It is relatively rare. This is Kathleen Bogart, who is someone who studies this condition, as well as someone who has the condition. And basically, it's just a slate face. Blinking doesn't even happen. They can speak, but with speech therapy, it affects not the vocal tract so much. So they can learn to articulate reasonably clearly and live a very nice life, but with no expression. You can imagine how difficult that would be personally. The question that Kathleen Bogart wanted to know was whether people with this condition, not being able to generate emotional facial expressions, could nonetheless understand emotional facial expressions. I'm sure she knew the answer, but you have to do the study to show it. And this was her result. Oh, first, in case you don't know, there are approximately 7 universal facial expressions that we all, as humans, can recognize. Here they are. This is due to the work of Paul Ekman. And they tested these in control individuals and people with Mobius syndrome, recognition accuracy in percent, and the key thing to notice is that the Mobius individuals are performing just as well, sometimes better, than the people with the ability to generate their face. So that's a problem. If you have a motor problem, you should have a perceptual problem. Here's another anomaly. This is a very interesting and eye-opening study that came out in 2007, I think. Basically, the observation was, so let me give you the background to understanding this experiment. If I generate a movement like this, okay, the claim is that because you're simulating my movements, what you've done in your brain is simulated that same movement. Okay? Because you've activated that circuit should now be primed. It should be hyperexcitable. Okay? It should be twitchy. And in fact, that's what you can demonstrate with a technique known as TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation. Basically, this is a figure-8 magnetic coil that generates a very strong magnetic field targeted to tissue inside the skull. That magnetic field produces an electric current that's orthogonal to the direction of the magnetic field and disrupts function. You can also excite function or disrupt function using TMS. So that's basically the method. So here's how these sorts of experiments go. You stimulate motor cortex. So your motor cortex is laid out, a body map of your cortex is living inside your brain. So you can find with the TMS coil, when you stimulate it, the region that makes your index finger twitch. Okay? So you find that area. You measure the motor evoked response. So here's a TMS stimulus. This is time. About if you stimulate motor cortex corresponding to the index finger, you can generate a muscle twitch measured down here about 20 milliseconds later, and that's what it looks like. Okay? So that's the basic measurement, stimulation and measurement paradigm. You can then do a study where you have people observing either pinky movement or index finger movements like this or pinky movements like this. You can stimulate either the index or the pinky area, and you can look at the effect on the motor evoked response. And basically what you find is that the response, I'll just describe it to you. If I do this, your motor evoked response is bigger after seeing this to an index finger movement. Your index finger motor evoked response is bigger because of seeing this action than if I did this. Okay? So when the observation and the stimulation line up, you get a bigger response. When they don't line up, you get a smaller response. This was taken as evidence that mirror neurons really are a basis for simulating actions. That we really do simulate actions that we observe. That's pretty compelling evidence, and part of what convinced people that this is true. This study showed that after you get this basic effect, if you bring people into the lab and train them to make pinky movements after observing index finger movements, so you just reverse associating the movements, and vice versa for pinky movements, index finger movements, the effect completely reverses. You get now, observing index finger movements, your pinky becomes twitchy because that's what you've learned. You've trained on that. That's the basic idea. Why is this a problem for mirror neurons? The problem is that... Sorry? Pre-training slide. Oh, pre-training. Yeah, there's pre-training. There's post-training. Thank you. It reverses. That's pre-training. That's post-training. What does this mean? It means that the motor excitability or the simulation mechanism dissociates from understanding. That is, presumably, if you spend 20 minutes or an hour making this movement in response to this, to seeing this, you don't suddenly misperceive this as this, right? That's the basic idea. So they didn't test it, probably didn't have to, but presumably these people who showed this reverse response still recognize this as index finger movement. So it dissociates from understanding. The motor response dissociates from understanding. And it turns out that the same result, if you look carefully, exists in monkeys. So in the mirror neuron literature, in the first papers that I talked about, the 92 and the 96 paper, one key interesting piece of evidence was that the cells did not respond when the when the experimenter grasped objects with tools. And that was seen as evidence for its biological relevance. It evolved to do this. Turns out that if you train the monkey in watching the experimenter grabbing objects with tools, pretty soon you will find cells in F5 that respond to tool observation. Okay? So something that can be trained in very quickly. They're called tool-responding mirror neurons. The interesting thing is that after this session, when the monkey has tool-responding mirror neurons, it doesn't seem to understand tool use. So they were using, for example, sticks to poke food and things like that. After the experiment was done, they left a piece of food just out of reach of the monkey and a stick, the same stick that they were using. All the monkey had to do was pick up the stick and stab the food. They report that the monkey never attempted to use the tool for reaching food, although the monkey grasped it and bit it. Again, dissociation between mirror neuron activity and the ability to understand those actions. Anomaly number 5. What is this action? Tongue chewing. I like it. Oh, tongue showing. Pouring. Someone said pouring. It's actually quite ambiguous with respect to the movements, right? So this could be depending on your perspective. If we're talking about the perspective of this picture, it's pouring. It could be filling if we're thinking about this picture. Transferring, it could be emptying, it could be spilling. If there's no water in there, it's none of the above, right? It's dependent on the context. Could be helping, could be obeying, could be defying. There's lots of possible meanings that are associated with this particular movement. Likewise, to fill, think about filling something. That's an action. You can achieve this in any number of ways, motorically. Okay? There's not a clear one-to-one relationship between the movements and the meanings of those movements. Okay? So it's really context dependent. Our understanding of actions is context dependent. There was a mirror neuron study that got a lot of press. It was published in Science. I'm going to talk to you about it briefly. It's a little bit complex, but I think we can get through it pretty straightforwardly. That show that it's really not the movements that's making the cells fire. That is, if I do this movement, it's not the movement itself that's causing your brain to simulate it to the extent that there are motor areas that respond. So let me walk you through this. It depends on the context. So here was the basic experiment. This was summarized. This is a figure from Scientific American. Rizzolatti was summarizing some of these results. The monkey was given one of two tasks, either to reach and grasp an object and eat it, or reach and grasp an object and put it in a container, okay? In which case the monkey, if performed successful, would get a reward. It turns out that there are cells that prefer one or the other type of movement. So there are cells that like bring to mouth, the eating neurons. And this is an example of a single cellular response. That's a histogram of response over trials showing that this cell that they're recording from likes the eating movement as opposed to the picking up and placing movement. You can see that there's not much of a response here. Interestingly, some of these cells also fired when an experimenter reached down and either ate or placed it in a container, and the preferences corresponded between the cells. So if the cell preferred reaching to eat, that same cell would tend to like observing the same action and not the other action. This got a lot of attention, excuse me, because the cells seemed to start responding before the action was complete. And the idea, the way that this was interpreted, was that these cells can actually read minds, that they were predicting the outcome of the action and therefore basically mind reading. But this is a problem for the study because if you think about it, this is the point of grasping. So the person is reaching down to grasp the apple and either bringing it to her mouth or putting it in a container. The mirror neuron is responding appropriately before the action is completed. How does it know that? There's no way to know. The movement is identical. It's not the movement that's driving it, okay? It can't be the movement. Okay, there's nothing different about the hand shape. There's nothing going on. The grasp is the same. That was the big point. The movement is identical. Again, telling us it's not the movement. Here's what you find if you look in the supplemental material of this original Science paper. Online material, not even in the body of the paper. The container was present only in the trials in which the grasped object was subsequently placed into it. The presence of the container acted as a cue, allowing the monkey to predict the most likely subsequent motor act. So basically, in this condition, there's no container. The animal knows what's going to happen. It's been trained and knows that this is going to be a grasp to the mouth. Okay, so again, what this tells us is that it's not the movement. It's not resonating as another term that people use in this context. It's not simulating the movements per se. That's not what's driving the cells. They only resonate when the context is right. Okay? And those contexts come from objects, situations, past training. How do they know when the context is right? If you have to simulate to understand. This is simulating after it understands. You see the problem? Where is that understanding coming from? And this is essentially the dark matter of the mirror neuron universe. You like the graphic? I thought that was kind of cool. It looked really boring on a black slide, so I put that back there. So, mirror neuron theory is wrong. Okay, these are a sketch of some of the arguments. There's a lot more in the book. You can read them all if you like. What I want to do is spend the remaining time kind of giving you a different perspective on things. Okay, so and basically what I want to do is to kind of flip it around. The Earth revolves around the sun rather than our geocentric version. I want to suggest that the motor system is basically a blind driver. That is, it's controlling movements, but it is completely blind, literally and figuratively, to the world. It relies on sensory information to know anything about what it's doing. This is illustrated really compellingly by the case of Ian Waterman. There's a PBS, actually BBC special you can watch. It's available on YouTube called The Man Who Lost His Body. Watch it. It's absolutely fascinating. The basic idea is this. He had a viral infection as a teenager, and when he recovered from it, he woke up in a hospital bed and he describes his situation. He couldn't move. He absolutely could not move. And then he realized he couldn't feel either. He couldn't feel anything. All he could do was kind of move his head a little bit. But from the neck down, he couldn't move his body whatsoever, nor could he feel it. It felt like he was floating to him. People could poke him, nothing. It turns out he had something called large fiber sensory neuropathy, which basically robs the brain of input from the sensory system. He could feel pain, but the somatosensation that's needed for guiding movement is lost. People who have this, it's very rare. People who have this basically are restricted to a wheelchair for the rest of their lives because you simply can't control your body. Interestingly, motor neurons are perfectly spared. There's nothing wrong with the motor system. You still can't move. So if you think about it for a minute, well, I can give you one easy example. If your arm, well, that's probably not a good example. If you come home from the dentist and your lip is numb, it's hard to talk. And that's not just because they've disrupted the motor part. Selective experiments where they've taken out the sensory part still disrupt speech production. But you can do a thought experiment. Imagine you're sitting at a table and you are numb from the waist down, from the neck down. And your hands are sitting here like this, and there's a tennis ball out there, and I ask you to reach for the tennis ball, but first close your eyes, okay? Actually, do this first. Imagine this experiment. Your hands are sitting here. Close your eyes and put your hand up in the air. Hold it for 5 seconds, bring it down, and then reach for the tennis ball, okay? Imagine that you're doing that. Now, imagine what it actually takes. As you're sitting here, normally you feel the table underneath you, but if you don't have any feeling, you don't know where your arms are. You have no idea. If you can't feel it, you don't know where your arms are. As you reach up, how do you know when to stop applying force, to stop and hold it? How do you know you're applying force appropriately as you're keeping it up there and not going like this? And then when you put it back on the table, how do you know where your arm is so that you can apply the reverse force? And now that it's nowhere to be found, you try to reach for the ball and you don't know what's going on. It's literally impossible to do any movements without sensory information. Ian, interestingly, was able to train himself to walk, to drive. He is successful. He lives independently. What's really interesting, basically the way he did it is without somatosensory input, he used his visual system to do it. He started watching his body and very laboriously using only visual feedback to generate these movements. And he was able to learn to do it. He even gestures. These gestures here are consciously controlled. We gesture naturally. He is conscious to look natural. He is consciously moving his hands around to look more natural. When he walks, he is consciously placing each step. You don't have to do that. Flip the lights off on him and he falls to the ground. Nothing. He has to sleep with a light on just in case he has to get up in the middle of the night. Fascinating case. The point is that unlike the motor system, if you damage the motor system in cerebral palsy or quadriplegia or ALS, you can still perceive and understand the world. This reverse is not true. You lose sensory input and the motor system is blind. It has no idea what it's doing. That's the point that I'm trying to make here. So the Earth does revolve around the sun. Action, perception, this is what the mirror neuron demonstration got right. Action and perception are indeed tightly linked. But action, it's the action that's grounded in perception. The motor system needs the sensory system, not the other way around. The mirror neuron claim has it basically backwards. So can we then promote a sensory theory of action understanding? Well, on the surface of it, it seems we can. There's an area called the superior temporal sulcus. It lives right here in the macaque, right here in the human. And in fact, it shows single cell responses in the monkey to observing actions, just like motor cortex does. In fact, it's a little bit more specific in terms of what's been discovered so far. There are cells that are tuned to or respond best to things like walking toward or away, head turning, movement into or out of view, eye gaze, head direction, hand-object interaction, including all of these behaviors. So there's another area on the table that, according to the mirror neuron theorists, is outside of the mirror system that has the right properties. In humans, this same region is known to respond to movement. A really interesting demonstration of this comes from what's called biological motion. Turns out we're really good at detecting moving bodies. This is an example. This doesn't look like much to you now, but if I put it in motion, you immediately recognize from just a few points of light what that thing is, that it's a person walking. And it turns out that if you ask people to view these things and compare that with more random moving dots, this superior temporal sulcus area activates quite well. So there's good evidence from humans. So in fact, STS is a better candidate than the mirror system for an action understanding system. But that's not even right. Still, the meaning isn't in the movement. Again, that same problem we had. If you do this movement, it doesn't tell you what's happening. You've got to have the context. You've got to have all this other information. There's a lot of moving parts. So just like we understand action because just like this statement is wrong, we understand action because the motor representation of that action is activated in our brain. A similar statement focusing on the sensory system, like we understand action because the STS action region system is activated in our brain, is also incorrect. That can't be right either. Basically, there is no one-sentence answer to how we understand actions, use language, or read minds. I'm not going to explain everything to you about how it works, but this is just to illustrate that there are a lot of moving parts. It's a complicated system. So if you think about recognizing an action in a normal context, you're seeing me reach for a teacup or something as we're sitting in a cafe. The kinds of things that are going to be involved are areas involved in low-level motion detection, object form detection. There's object areas in your brain. You're going to categorize that object as a cup as opposed to the salt shaker or something like that. There's a biological motion detection system. You're going to have to do some face recognition to figure out who you're interacting with and connect that with your memories of what I'm likely to do. Do I like tea? Do I not like tea? All of this is relevant in terms of understanding whether I'm going to reach for a teacup. The attention control systems, emotional relevance is important in making decisions for action in particular. And if you need to generate an action in response, then your motor system gets involved. So it's a complicated story, way more complicated than this. But the good news is that there is a lot of progress being made. So basically, solving the action understanding question is darn close to solving the how does the brain work problem, which was part of the allure of the mirror neuron claim because it simplified all this difficulty. Lots of progress is being made on all fronts. There are visual scientists studying this. There are people studying object recognition, face recognition. A lot of the pieces are out there in the literature. We could put together a more coherent, reasonable theory if we just start putting them together. I talk a little bit about that in the book as well. How are we doing on time?
You're doing great.
Doing great. Okay, so I mentioned imitation, which is a really interesting thing. So I want to talk a little bit about imitation in the context of mirror neurons and more generally. Because it's an interesting topic for one, and number two, it kind of highlights some of the anomalies that the mirror neuron, or the puzzles that mirror neuron theory gets itself into. So this is a quote from Andrew Meltzoff, who's a long-time researcher on imitation. And he has said, "It is widely celebrated that our species manifests creativity and thought, that is Homo sapiens. Evidence for this is coupled, especially during our early period of rapid psychological growth, with a powerful complementary proclivity for recreation and imitation," which he calls Homo imitans, and I see my autocorrector fix that for me. Thank you very much. So imitation is pervasive. If you've ever dealt with kids, you know that imitation happens constantly. It happens on the baseball field. This is Andy Meltzoff's original study. It was published in Science a couple decades ago. He did a heroic study where he went into the neonatal ward in the hospital, very young babies, and did experiments like this where he would model a behavior and the baby generated a response to try to see if this was something that was innate. He's argued that it is. A little bit questionable now, but For our purposes, it doesn't matter. Very nice work that he's done on imitation. It's smart. It's a smart system. Quite interesting. What does imitation do for us? There are some obvious things like social learning. We learn skills, behaviors, cultural traditions via observation. If we can watch an expert performing a task, then we can save the time of trying to figure it out ourselves. And there's evidence that goes way back there's even some evidence suggesting that there was some imitation of flint knapping, so just carving stones. Based on the distribution of the chips, it looked like there was one area where there was an expert flint knapper and then a spread, as if a kid is walking around going like this, very inexpertly. That was the interpretation. In any case, we see that all the time today. Obviously, social learning is important. Mind reading is another thing, ability that is supposed, according to some people, and I have no reason to doubt it necessarily, that is dependent on the ability to imitate. And the argument goes like this. Imitation is innate, and what that does is it solves the correspondence problem, in a sense, is what people have termed it. That is, it links other action with self-action. If we can innately imitate, we now understand that there's a relation between what you're doing and what I'm doing. Given that, then we have experience that links our own actions with mental states. You come here as a kid, you pick up a toy, you realize that your desires are driving that behavior. Oh, I have a mind. I can do things consciously. I do what I want to do. And therefore, my actions are driven by mental states. If you have these two things, the argument goes, you can then infer that other people's behaviors are also driven by their own minds and their own beliefs. That's theory of mind. So imitation is important in that respect. Language, not the whole story. I could give a whole other lecture on why imitation isn't enough to give you language. But the argument is that it gets kids off the ground. If you start imitating speech, that kind of bootstraps things and gets you going. So basically, imitation has been argued to be very, very important. Mirror neurons are exquisitely tuned to support this kind of behavior, right? That's what they do. They take input of a particular action and generate a copy of it. So if it's the case that mirror neurons are the basis of imitation, even if the action understanding idea doesn't hold water, if they can be shown to be the basis of imitation, then they can explain a lot about human behavior and be very important theoretically. And in fact, the evidence that this area, this Broca's area, the region thought to contain mirror neurons, supports imitation is better than the evidence that it supports action observation. They actually had a lot of trouble. Rizzolatti called their effort to find an area that responded both during action observation and execution rather disappointing because it failed in the early days. Some evidence for it now. So imitation looks like it's the perfect thing. That's how mirror neurons can remain important theoretically. In fact, people proposed that monkey mirror neurons were the basis of monkey imitation. They initially called them, at least some people did, monkey see, monkey do neurons. That kind of went away. So the main problem with this idea that mirror neurons support imitation is that no one believes that it's true. So even Rizzolatti and Meltzoff believe that these don't support imitation, and the reason they don't believe it is because macaques don't imitate. So here's a claim. This is Rizzolatti. There is vast agreement among ethologists that imitation, the capacity to learn to do an action from seeing it done, is present among primates, only in humans and probably in apes. Therefore, the primary function of mirror neurons cannot be action imitation. Monkeys do not imitate, says Meltzoff, although they certainly have the basic motor mirror neuron machinery. Something more is needed to prompt and support behavioral imitation. So let's think about this. So we have a claim that lots of people believe that mirror neurons support action understanding. There's lots of contradictory evidence for that. People believe it. Yet they are claimed not to support imitation in macaques despite being perfectly tuned to do so. They don't believe that. Except in humans where mirror neurons do support imitation as a result of some additional evolutionary modification that we don't know what that is, but that happened. Nonetheless, mirror neurons are supposed to support imitation. The important point here is that the simulation motor, the simple motor simulation mechanism of macaque mirror neurons, that's their very appeal, remember, it's simple, isn't even enough to explain human imitation. Okay? Something more is needed. And again, it's that dark matter. I suggest that it's basically the human mind. It's all the stuff that's sitting around mirror neurons that are making use of it. They're basically the reason why we imitate. Let me see if I have yes, I do have something on this. The reason why we imitate is because we have systems like language systems and mind-reading systems, so-called, that can make use of imitations. And so it makes use of that simple mechanism. You might wonder then, what are mirror neurons doing? And I'll give you my story. Interestingly, and because I want to give credit where credit is due, the Parma group who discovered mirror neurons had the theory exactly right in their original paper. This is a quote from the first paragraph of the discussion after the experiment was presented in the paper. And they write, because they can say it better than I can, one of the fundamental functions of the premotor cortex, that's the region we're talking about, is that of retrieving appropriate motor acts in response to sensory stimuli. Evidence has been provided that action retrieval can occur in response to two-dimensional patterns, color and size and shape of three-dimensional objects. So that's the original motor object grasping stuff that I talked about. That's the kind of thing that's going on here when the monkey is using location and shape information to grasp and reach for an object. They continue immediately. The present data, talking about the observation that some cells in this network also respond to actions, the present data indicate that in addition to these physical factors, retrieval can also occur in response to the meaning of the gestures made by other individuals. If one considers the rich social interactions within a monkey group, the understanding by a monkey of actions performed by other monkeys must be a very important factor in determining action selection. Thus, the capacity of inferior premotor neurons to select actions according to gesture meanings fits well in the conceptual framework of current theory on the functions of premotor cortex and expands it to include movement selection related to interpersonal relations. So the basic idea is that just like this circuit, more broadly speaking, takes sensory input, object shape, location, size, and uses it to select appropriate actions, makes perfect sense. Doesn't mean it's the basis of object understanding. It's used to access our motor vocabulary. The same is true of action perception. We perceive actions. Your actions are relevant to my movements. If you start chasing me, I need to do something about it. If you're about to hit me, I need to do something about it. If you put your hand out, then I might need a mirror neuron to copy that behavior. So the idea is that mirror neurons are essentially sensory motor cells doing the same thing that these regular object-based mirror neurons are. But macaques still don't imitate, right? So that's the problem. This is, in fact, why the Parma researchers abandoned this original theory. That was their first interpretive impulse, and it makes a lot of sense, right? But these cells were responding in mirror fashion, like direct imitation. And macaques don't do direct imitation like we do. We can directly imitate. There's a very interesting literature on the tendencies for humans to imitate. It's called the chameleon effect. Woody Allen made a movie about it, which was quite entertaining. We do tend to imitate. Humans do it prodigiously. Macaques don't. And this was why the Parma group eventually rejected the theory. They said, it can't be that. It's got to be something else. What do we have left? The only theoretical alternative was action understanding. At the time, it was quite reasonable. I think it was a very reasonable move to take. It didn't hold up to the data, unfortunately. And now we know a little bit more about imitation. People have been studying it more closely in animals and in humans. And we know, in fact, that if we broaden our definition of imitation to include observational learning, doesn't have to be directly mirroring, then lots of species do that, including everything from cephalopods. There's a great demonstration of it in the octopus, to dogs and macaques as well. To give you an example of that, there is an interesting behavior that free-ranging Japanese macaques have been observed. There was a free-ranging troop in Japan near Kyoto that were being studied. And they noticed that a single individual, young female, started playing with stones in a productive way. It wasn't using it to do anything, just rolling it, clacking it, piling it, pushing it, doing things like that. A lot of her generational companions started doing the same thing. They started generating these what's called stone play behaviors. The parents of these kids never picked it up. The parents were like, whatever, I got stuff to do. But the kids all picked it up in the troop. They then mated and had offspring, and the offspring picked it up. And now there's a whole troop of Japanese macaques who do this. And they've spread into different groups. Okay? They've moved into different areas, so you'd have different subgroups. They all do it, but they've developed dialects. So some of them will do certain types of behaviors and not others, and vice versa. And you can basically calculate the relation between troops geographically by looking at their stone play. If they live closer together, then they're going to have more overlapping stone play repertoires. If they live farther away, it's going to be less overlapping. They're speaking different languages of stone play, in a sense. So this is kind of like culture, and macaques do it. They're obviously picking up the actions of one animal and using that to generate and to do interesting things. Presumably this involves mirror neurons, but it's not because of mirror neurons that they're doing this. It's something higher level that is motivating them to do that. It doesn't happen automatically. It's motivating them to do that. And then they recruit this mirror system, this lower level reflexive-like mirror system, to actually carry it out. So that's an example. There are other interesting examples of that sort. So the future of mirror neurons, let me just say a couple words about that. Basically, I think what I was saying earlier, that they're gonna be relevant. Mirror neurons are doing interesting things. We have to, even socially, we have to be able to observe and react to motorically other people's actions. But they're not going to be anything special. They're going to be integrated into this broader, what's been referred to as dorsal stream system, where basically, to give you a brief overview of the most important division in the brain, it's not left versus right brain, by the way, that's a myth. A more important distinction is the dorsal ventral distinction. There's lots and lots of evidence that information flowing down into the temporal lobes is used for connecting what we're experiencing visually and auditorily with our memories, with conceptual objects. You're recognizing things, connecting it with past memories. Whereas this dorsal stream takes that same visual information and processes it in a different way to integrate it with the motor system, to generate movements if a movement is called for. So presenting an object to a monkey and asking him to recognize it will recruit this stream. Damage to this stream will impair the monkey's ability to recognize it, but not its ability to reach for it, and vice versa. If you present that task where you present an object to a monkey and ask him to reach for it, it doesn't have to recognize the object in order to perform the motor task. And there's some interesting dissociations in humans of patients who have damage to the ventral stream and can generate movements, can interact in the world and have no idea what they're looking at. It's called visual object agnosia. Vice versa, you can have patients with damage to the dorsal stream who can recognize objects all day long, but can't orient their body to the objects. They can't reach for them normally. In some cases, they can't even orient their eyes to look at them because they don't have the visual motor control, ocular control. In order for them to see, if you put something out here, they'll say, ask them what you see, they'll say something like, video camera, because that's where their eyes happen to be looking. And then you do this, and they're like, oh, it's a little clicker thing. Basically, they've lost the dorsal stream and retain the ventral stream. This is an important computational distinction in how the brain is organized, much more important than left-right differences. And there are some, but they're much exaggerated in the press. So mirror neurons are part of this dorsal stream. They're in the motor system, involved in controlling actions. They're going to get rolled into a broader picture of this. That's what I would like, what I believe will happen and what I'm trying to promote. And remember that there were only 12 of 39 that showed these pure mirror responses. There are plenty of other cells, 27 in fact, in this initial study, that responded to perceiving actions that were non-mirror. In fact, some of them were anti-mirror. They responded best when the monkey reached for an object and motorically, and then responded best when the experimenter placed an object. That makes a lot of sense. You want a cell that's going to generate a response to grab the object that someone just put down. You don't want to mirror everything. And these 27 cells presumably are part of that broader system. Okay, that's all I got.
Very good. We'll take a few questions, and then you can get your books over here, get them signed over here. We'll start. Let's start right here.
Yes. So thanks for a fantastic talk. I just have a couple of concerns.
And then repeat the question.
You're clearly reasonably peeved by the kind of popular press around mirror neuron research, and as one would be. But those kind of things have occurred around almost every kind of new popular science, whether it be electricity or artificial intelligence. So, aren't you unfairly bashing the mirror neuron theorists for an effect of popular culture? That's the first part of the question. When you mentioned Ramachandran's Big Bang quip, right, you kind of sneered at it a bit, but didn't say why. And what I wonder about is what's left. I think that your deconstruction of the whole brouhaha is very clear, but you are looking at this from the point of view of a language specialist, and perhaps the significance of the mirror neuron system is its non-linguistic.
Okay, so just to summarize, the first question was, am I being unduly harsh on the mirror neuron enterprise just because of its popularity outside the lab? It's fun and easy to poke at the magic therapy bears based on mirror neurons, and that's an example of some of the things that the mirror neuron theorists themselves poke fun at. But if you notice, the stuff that I talked about was core to the claim. I didn't focus on those claims and show why magic therapy bears are not the right answer or invalid. I focused on these cells' abilities to do what they were claimed to do, which is understand actions and process language and to do theory of mind. So no, I don't think I'm being overly harsh. I'm attacking the things that they really claim that they do. The second question about Ramachandran's, so language theorists, is that, am I biased or only talking about part of the story because I'm focusing on language? I don't think so, for a couple of reasons. One is that a lot of the motivation, in fact, the motivation for the mirror neuron position came out of the speech world. So it's not quite known, but there was an old theory called the motor theory of speech perception. Everyone knows about that. Basically the idea was that we don't perceive speech sounds. What we perceive is speech gestures. So as you're listening to my speech, according to this theory, you're not really analyzing the sounds. You're taking that sound information to recover the movements that I'm making, and you're interpreting the sounds based on the movements. So you don't have to understand how that works, but that's basically the idea. Lots of research that was proposed back in the 50s. Lots of research in that area for a few decades basically disproved it. And by the time mirror neurons were discovered, the theory was dead. When I went to graduate school in the late 80s, that theory was taught as an interesting idea, but it was wrong. It just turned out empirically to be wrong. In fact, the reason for interpreting mirror neurons was inspiration from the motor theory of speech perception. So it was motivated essentially by a dead theory to begin with. So language has actually been central to the enterprise from the beginning. The first things that they generalized to were speech and language processes, and that's how it jumped species into humans. So I think it's actually quite fair to use language as a test case, because if it can't hold up in that area, it makes us question all the others. Are there non-linguistic or other manual-related things that you could look at? People have. There's a syndrome called apraxia, limb apraxia, in which people can't voluntarily control movements normally. And there's been some studies to see if people with apraxia also have deficits in action recognition. They claim that there is, but it only occurs, and there are patients who have deficits in both. But there are also about a third of them who have deficits in generating actions, who have limb apraxia and can understand actions just fine. Same is true in cerebral palsy or ALS or anything like that. So I should say that there's lots of evidence that I didn't talk about here that's discussed in there. I've presented, obviously, because of time constraints, a very cut and dry, simple version. All of this is nuanced. There are claims and counterclaims, and I can talk about very detailed, interesting TMS studies that seem to support mirror neuron work. I discuss it in the book, exactly why it doesn't count. But so is Ramachandran, is there something lurking back there? I think there is. I mean, basically Ramachandran's claim, and Rizzolati's claim, is that mirror neurons alone, as they exist in macaques, don't explain human behavior. They had to evolve, but that was the foundation. So that's an interesting idea. But basically, when you think about what's evolving, we kind of already knew that. And it's not that mirror neurons seem to be that special in our evolutionary line. So if dogs have it, if octopus have it, if it's a very simple mechanism that doesn't seem to relate to anything in a automatic kind of bootstrapping way, which is what I've tried to argue, then it doesn't really provide much of a foundation. Yes, there was a great leap forward. It doesn't seem that mirror neurons are the basis of that leap forward. I saw some hands up there.
Yeah. Have they detected mirror neurons in cephalopods?
Have they detected mirror neurons in cephalopods? No, they've detected them in birds. The birdsong system is very similar to our human speech system, at least at a functional level. And so they've detected them in birds, but not in any other animals. I'm sure they exist. The recent study just this week came out, suggests that they exist in dogs, not directly measured, but I'm sure they exist in almost any species that we would look at that has the need to do sensory motor integration and can learn.
If they're present in invertebrates, or if they're present in cephalopods, then they would evolutionarily must have been present in our last common ancestor.
Yes, they would be very old, which isn't surprising to me because I see them as a very simple sensory motor linkage. And any animal that takes sensory information and has to react to it motorically is going to have these sorts of cells. And if that information is coming from moving bodies, then you have to have a cell that responds to the observation of action and generates some action.
I've heard about and I've read about paradigm shifts. Thank you for bringing one to us today. I'm delighted to hear about your research.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Over here and then over here. Yes?
Yeah, about 40 years ago, Albert Bandura introduced modeling and imitation into behavioral modification type therapies and greatly expanded the effectiveness of those kinds of therapies. I'm interested in your thought about possible clinical implications of the kind of research you're doing right now.
Yeah, I'm not a clinician, so it's hard for me to say much, very much insightful about this. I know that people are using mirror neuron theory as an inspiration to do aphasia therapy, that is language disorder therapy, and other sorts of things. On Twitter, I keep having these battles between me and a psychotherapist who's really into this stuff, and we argue back and forth. You can follow along if you have the stomach for it. So it's being used. It might even be effective to imitate. I mean, humans are very good at imitating. It could be useful. My claim, and actually I believe that this mirror circuit is, at the motoric level, the basis of our ability to imitate. That seems reasonable to me. But it doesn't explain how we understand what we might want to imitate, because human imitation is smart. If we imitate everything all the time, it's pathological. It's called echo phenomenon, and it's not normal. It's a neurological disorder. So it has to be smart, and the question then is, where does this smartness come from? It's that dark matter stuff, and it's the rest of cognition that's sitting around this system saying, this is important, generate an action like the one you just saw. So it could be effective. I don't, I wouldn't want the take-home message of this to be that imitation or using some sort of copying mechanism isn't going to be helpful in certain situations. Certainly, I like to imitate a lot of other people who are smarter than me and better than me at things. Question over here.
Philosophically, I guess the idea that mirror neurons would, imitation would explain everything. The problem I have with that is it would lead to an endless hall of mirrors of human thought and behavior, all these saluting Nazis. But it doesn't explain where creativity comes from, like Mozart, Einstein, Bach, and everything. Where do they mirror from?
Yeah, it doesn't explain a lot of things. And one of the big problems with the mirror neuron theory is, I'll just kind of extrapolate in a slightly different direction than where you were going on that. But everything, the brain has basically turned into one big mirror, one big simulation mechanism. There's a theory called embodied cognition that is gaining a lot of traction. And they basically say that we simulate things. There's no computation, there's nothing, just simulation. But if the whole brain turns into a simulator, then we're back to square one. That's the how does the brain work problem. It doesn't answer any questions. Young lady right here.
There's literature showing that non-psychotic twins are much greater cooperation, all with empathy work on another than non-psychotic twins. And I wonder if you think that you could understand those processes in relation to mirror neurons or related concepts. And has anyone ever done studies using pairs of relatives to vary genetic relatedness?
I'm not aware of any. There could be work out there. I'm not aware of any studies on monozygotic twins and imitation or mirroring or anything like that. I would say that it's not the mirror system that's driving this. The mirror system is a low-level dumb system in the sense that it's almost reflexive, connecting sensory input with motor output. The systems that funnel information into that system is really what is doing all the work. And so there could be interesting relations in twins between those higher level systems that are feeding into mirror systems. So I would be skeptical as to whether the mirror system itself is responsible for that. Right.
In your presentation, you mentioned how we have neurons in the frontal cortex, in the motor neurons, as well as certain areas that deal with recognition of three-dimensional structures. Has anybody tried to show neurons associated with emotions such as pain?
Yes, there's people who have suggested that there is a kind of mirroring or simulation of emotions as well. And so there are studies, not just pain, but there are studies of simple somatosensation. So it turns out that if you watch a video of someone being tickled with a feather on their knee, your knee area will light up in your somatosensory cortex, and that's the explanation is that what's happening is that the way you understand what that person is feeling is you simulate that feeling in your brain. And that could be, it doesn't tell us what's going on. Just to say that something is simulated doesn't tell us computationally what it's doing. It might tell us where to look to figure it out. But it isn't, to say that something is simulation isn't quite the answer. The other problem with that is there's associations that we have built up, of course. You've been tickled on the knee. You watch someone being tickled on the knee, you can generate an association to what it might feel like. It doesn't mean that your ability to image what that actually feels like is your understanding of that action. So that's a slightly different question.
This is mostly animal studies, correct? I just wonder about early childhood development. The Broca's area is not fully developed until at least 18 months. So what is that relationship between a child and parents or teachers? I mean, what implications can you draw from all this?
Developmentally, in terms of this system not developing quite, is that the question? Well, since I've kind of debunked the whole system, I'm not sure that I can draw any implications from it. Essentially, what I would say is that whatever applies to sensory motor learning, because really, for me, the mirror neuron system is just part of a sensory motor learning system. Whatever applies in terms of developmental implications to sensory motor learning generally is going to be applicable to mirror neurons. I don't think it goes anywhere beyond that. It's a simple sensory motor system.
Dr. Hickok, I want to thank you for your work because I had a brain aneurysm and like Ian or in there, when I close my eyes or if I'm in the dark, I fall over and I have no knowledge of where my limbs are So touching like this or touching my nose is, you know, totally random. and so I believe that the kind of work that you're doing, that it will contribute to the understanding of this and will provide maybe some tools for rehabilitation or ways to compensate, you know. So, I mean, I walk by looking at spots on the ground and things like that. So you're building that. Thank you for that. But I have a very simple question, I think.
Thank you.
I remember being in communication or sales courses where you're taught to, you come in and shake hands, and then you sit with the person, and then you know, if he sits up, you sit up. You know, if he folds his arms, you fold your arms. And that's supposed to build a sense of trust, a sense of, I mean, how does that fit into this? It's like, I know it was, you have some psychology, you have some other
Right.
kind of science, which I don't understand, like, at all.
Yeah, so the question is interesting. How did the tendency or the instruction that may be common, I don't live in that world, but to imitate the person you're trying to impress or connect with. There's some truth to that. So this is the chameleon effect that I talked about. And it's not, that's one way to get someone to accept you, is to act like them, and they tend to like you better. So they've done experiments along these lines, and it works. It seems to work. Likewise, if you just put a naive person in a situation, and you'll start noticing this now that I mention it, put a naive subject in a situation, sitting next to someone who is either scratching their head or rubbing their leg or something like that, the tendency to copy is much higher in those situations. They tend to do that, to copy along. That's the chameleon effect. People think that that what this might be good for is for building social relationships. If you're in an in crowd, you're going to do the similar things, and that helps groups recognize who's on their side and who's not. And you can imagine how that might be useful back in the day when we were hunting and gathering. So that's an important system. That's largely unconscious. We don't think about doing it. We don't understand that we're doing anything, and it really dissociates from understanding. It's also a very smart system as well. We don't imitate people we don't like. So only people that we want to be like. So there's something higher level, again, that's feeding into that system to imitate.
I think it was Pinker also points out that empathy is also one of these things that's oversold. I mean, it's like the cure-all if we could just be an empathetic civilization or whatever, but in fact it feeds into xenophobia and tribalism. You're empathetic to the people that are like you in your group, which makes you even more xenophobic to those who are not like you. And that's one of those things that can cut both ways. Anyway, again, you can get your books here, get them signed here. Thank you for coming. Thank our speakers.